Self-worth. It seems like a pretty big deal, doesn't it? Has anyone ever in your life talked to you about what you're worth? My guess, looking at the state of our world today, is probably not. Without American Indians, First Nation and Métis people, our world would probably look a lot different today. That's not to condone colonialism, especially in the context of the contributions Indigenous and Aboriginal peoples shared with other people of the world and with no credit. I'm not talking about what would happen if Hitler won the Second World War. I'm talking about empires that would have continued without colonization and what the world would look like apart from the contributions that Indian peoples shared with humanity. For one, there would be no such nation who call themselves Métis. But you wouldn't have Americans either. You might have a Karl Marx, but not likely. Self-worth, dignity, freedom, democracy, and individual rights would not likely have developed as well as it could under authoritarian regimes, empires, pyramid schemes. Centralized power would stifle it. It is because of what North and South American Indian people shared with empires since first contact, 1492, that you could have nationalism, patriotism, democracy, which is how Hitler was defeated. Yet there remains something missing among our democracies, constitutions, Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, all of which originate from North and South American Indians. Russell Means quoted Benjamin Franklin, who correctly identified neighbors to the north as a near-perfect society enduring for centuries, the Iroquois confederacy, which all societies emulate. That is your legacy as North and South American Indian people, and there is so much more to that you or I probably don't know. But it's worth finding out once you understand how the world needs you. North and South American indigenous people have been here since time immemorial, our stories tell us. The archaeologists didn't believe it. They couldn't believe that Indian people have been around longer than recorded history. But now they can't ignore the proof they so required for decades. They found evidence of human activity in a cave in Mexico, and the carbon dating indicates people have been on these two continents for over 30,000 years, predating the oldest known civilization, Sumer. You are children and youth with a lasting and enduring civilization that has existed longer than any known civilization in history. By comparison, your legacy is far more advanced than Western civilization. Western civilization remains backwards in terms of freedom, democracy, and independence. You have contributed more to humanity than the wheel, agriculture, the invention of the alphabet, the printing press, mathematics, nuclear fission, computers, and the internet, all of which are useless measures of progress without dignity, all of which are mere tools of a slave. I am offering a radical way of thinking about the origins and contributions of two-leggeds, which can be directly traced back to indigenous people of Turtle Island, but specifically to indigenous youth. All sacred teachings, all dignity, self-worth, self-actualization, human rights can be directly traced to the circle of power, our sacred fire, Aboriginal, Indigenous, Native, Métis, Indian youth. Any elder anywhere in North or South America cannot deny that it is the circle of power, youth, that gave us dignity, freedom, independence, our rights and privileges, our Constitution, our great law of peace. Russell Means advises we reread our Constitution, our birthright, our inheritance, our highest law, which all law must be consistent, or they would be unconstitutional. This law includes the Canadian Constitution too, because our Constitution must be consistent with our allied nations, or we would be in violation of peace accords and treaty, all of which can be traced back to the great law of peace. The United Nations would not exist without the Great Law of Peace, the contributions of Blackfoot people, the Métis people's contributions to Manitoba and Canadian democracy and freedom. We find it difficult to accept that we still live in a society that at its core devalues humanity, a society that is based on a pyramid, a now racially stratified, hierarchical, authoritarian, and patriarchal society. Our children are now born indentured servants that must work very hard to prove their worth to an overseer and headmaster who cannot or will not acknowledge our children's worth. Our children are born worthless, and when you deprive them of their worth, unconditional love, positive self-regard, treated with indignity, children cope by dreaming up fantasy worlds that don't match reality. Well, it's depressing. In time, the naturally occurring endorphins that are produced in our bodies so that we can feel good are no longer produced, which means that it's impossible to feel good. We reach for things that make us feel good, too often in desperation and with immediate gratification needs, and because we develop in a world where you don't want to be caught with your hands in the cookie jar, you have to suffer or sneak. Such a life is a life without dignity. Our children develop in a world of overseers and masters they cannot escape. Without dignity, you have nothing. When was the last time someone talked to you about your worth? Probably a job interview. The problem is, we don't talk to our children enough about their worth if we ever have. If we did talk to our children about the great law of peace, our constitutions, our highest law, in which all law must be consistent, in our states and provinces, among our allies and United Nations, we would have eliminated indignities and inhumanities long ago. Was the Declaration of Independence enough? According to Benjamin Franklin, the great law of peace worked near perfectly for centuries. Why didn't it work for the United States of America? Means quotes Benjamin Franklin saying he had ideas of forming a more perfect union than one that endured for centuries. And there you have it, fixing what isn't broken. The attempt to improve on a peace accord that was self-evident near perfect for centuries meant that the social engineers believed they could do better. But did they? If Gandalf the Grey were at this meeting and discussing freedom and independence, he would have said, "And he that breaks a thing to find out what it is has left the path of wisdom." The Union the Founding Fathers wanted to create was one that would include people who inherited 10,000 years of indentured servitude, authoritarianism, centralized power, people who couldn't possibly comprehend freedom because they had no experience with it. Thomas Jefferson wrote, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness." Clearly, this is unlike the great law of peace. It is misogynistic, patriarchal, paternalistic, racist, and a racist document written by a slave owner attempting to improve on the great law of peace. Hidden from these comprehensions, there was a power that corrupted the interpretation, translation, processing among Jefferson and others. Europeans born into a legacy of slave culture knew better before they met Indians, but their knowledge still would never be enough to end a culture of indentured servitude. Even after witnessing what freedom and independence truly is, and borrowing heavily from Indian laws, traditions, cultures, self-righteousness would snap shut any recognition of the value, worth in any lives. And what did Americans get in return for the blood and sacrifice against their oppressors? The same freedom and independence they had before the War of Independence, with a few exceptions. For one, you get to vote for your king, and since then we have never seen a queen president. Dickinson describes precisely the way in which the Indian practiced self-determination and self-government, as documented by colonizers long before the 1776 publication of the Declaration of Independence. Chiefs, she says, held no centralized power, and communities had systems to prevent centralization of power. Chiefs had to be eloquent speakers that had the ability to convince people to follow their lead and then to produce something of benefit to the community that would uplift everyone equally. Leadership was based on how much a person would give away, whatever they owned, and so this often meant the chief was the poorest person in the community. This may be the truest sense of utilitarianism practiced since time immemorial, and yet older than history's first written documentation concerning the philosophy. All of these descriptions of history are recorded in European people's diaries, logbooks, accountings. They noted how much power women held in the community. They didn't write about equality rights because that was beyond their comprehension, especially in consideration of women. Feminism and equality were repressed in the mindset and perceptions of the patriarchal until the Indian would teach them the virtues of equality and dignity in traditional teachings, and later the great law of peace. In a CBC Massey Lecture number 1 entitled In the Beginnings, Sally Armstrong describes women gaining equality without ever mentioning Indian people and their contribution to equality rights for women. Armstrong says that it was the suffragettes that made the real difference to equality rights in the world today. Feminism, suffragette, hashtag #MeToo, hashtag Time's Up, Black Lives Matter, the Berlin Wall would not have been torn down. Tiananmen Square, Arab Spring, and all other revolutions couldn't be possible without Indian people. But many of you don't know about Indian ways, and even if I were or someone else were to tell you, it would remain incomprehensible. You couldn't possibly understand it unless, and there's an unless in there. Bill Gates and Elon Musk would never make a good chief, and since we hold these truths to be self-evident, Donald Trump is not a good chief either. In this system of democracy, hold these truths to be self-evident, not all men are created equal. While colonizers had since 1492 the opportunity to learn about dignity and self-respect, 284 years of relationship building would come and go. No concept of humility would enter the self-righteous mindset. 244 years later, well into the Enlightenment era, there remains no conception of freedom, independence, democracy, human dignity. There was a time when power expressed itself in humility, respect, truth, courage, love, wisdom, honor, engendering balance and harmony peacefully in life and death among all our relations, the two-legged, the four-legged, those that fly, those that swim, those that crawl, the tree nations, the rock nations, and the star nations. Today, the great abomination holds these truths to be self-evident, that when Thomas Jefferson wrote his glorious words, he and others like him didn't comprehend what it was they were writing. People wanted to be free and independent, now that they could clearly see for themselves what dignity, humanity, and culture looked like, having even run away from their own empires to live among Indians. They didn't like paying taxes. Their own writings, in their own words, they would talk about Indians most enviously if you understand their malignant self-love. torn between loyalty to the empire and with internal conflicts and with great mental anguish, secretly wished for freedom, independence, dignity, and worth. In their diaries, logbooks, and accountings, memos, they could write about it, but they didn't know how to implement it, because these were foreign concepts to the assimilated, the indentured servant society. They had not been born into it. They didn't have a language for it. The meaning and the meanings were lost in translation, and so they could not internalize it, and now we live as though they did, dreaming but never knowing. If you listen to Russell Means, this is what he is describing: the trap of having a constitution but never talking about it, never teaching children their worth, which is the last thing a boss wants you to know: your worth.